This is Faith Still Seeking, a program about Christian theology. I believe, but I want to know more. I'm not a minister. I'm not a PhD. I'm just a layman, and I'm doing theology. Yeah, I definitely don't have it all figured out, but it's never stopped me from trying.
What the fuck am I doing here? Guess I'm looking for a place to be. I don't know what the hell to believe. I wish I had the answers up my sleeve.
Hi, and welcome to the first episode of a new podcast called Faith Still Seeking. My name is Kelly Wilson. I am the host and writer of this show. I am a writer, a podcaster. I am a student of theology, a lifelong student. Some of that in the academy, and some of that, actually a great deal of that, studying on my own. So what is the show about? Hey, Kelly, what is the show about? It is an exploration of the core principles of Christianity. First, we have to kind of figure out what those core principles are, but looking at the history and teaching, and in some cases, the various interpretations of those principles, values, beliefs, and how they've changed or not changed over time. But it's a journey of discovery with somebody who started in a certain way of believing and pushed it hard enough that it kind of broke and fell apart, and then came back into it in a new way of believing, but with a lot of unanswered questions. And I feel like now I want to go forward and find answers to those questions if they're still there. Where am I coming from? I want to put this out there first, because I know that often when I look at religion podcasts, sometimes I see something that seems really interesting, and then I get a little ways into it, and the next thing I know, they've said some political comment or something where I go, oh, this is not the podcast for me. So I want to be as upfront as I can about who I am, where I'm coming from. I am a Christian. I call myself a Christian. I also feel a need to modify that somewhat. I don't know if I would go so far as to say I'm not that kind of Christian, but I am a certain kind of Christian. I am what some would call a progressive Christian. I'm not crazy about that term, because I don't feel like progressive Christians have progressed past any other type of Christian. I feel like we just have a different way of looking at things. And in some ways it is more historical and traditional than what in America you would look around and see as popular Christianity. Is progressive Christian the best way to describe it? I don't know that it is, but it at least gives you a little bit of an indication of where I am, that I'm liberal, left-leaning, but come from a very conservative fundamentalist background. I still have a lot of those connections. I grew up in a lot of those beliefs, and I try to somehow span the gap between the more liberal, mainline, and beyond type of Christian with the traditional, I want to say traditional and conservative. We all believe in the same person who is claimed to be the deity, that we all believe somehow in Jesus, or we're all followers of Jesus. We all are people of the same book, even though that book is not necessarily a single book, but a library of lots and lots of books written by many different people at many different times in many different places in many different genres for many different audiences in many different circumstances over the course of thousands of years. So it's not just one book. And it always requires interpretation. Even the most plain reading of the Bible requires interpretation on some level of trying to connect with the historical context and language of the people who wrote it. I want to try to see if there are some common understandings that we can find between the many, many different forms and expressions of Christianity that there are. There was a time in my life when I really wanted to find what I thought was the real Christianity, the quote unquote real Christianity, that I was going to look at the Bible, and after 2,000 years of Christians trying to interpret it, that I, in my arrogance, was somehow going to be the one to get it. Will the real Christianity stand up? I've kind of given up on that pursuit just because I don't think it exists. Or if it does exist, I don't believe that it exists in a way that's going to be easily apprehended mentally by people here on earth. When I think about the first couple centuries of the church trying to figure things out, that they each had these different understandings, and even being as close to the events as they were, they still didn't quite have it all nailed down. In fact, some of their ideas were pretty weird and out there. But even Paul, who was as far as I understand, and what I've read of the scholarship, I believe that Paul was the earliest writer of the New Testament, that the Gospels, although these stories had been shared by groups of people and were revered enough that that it was very important to the people sharing those stories to be able to communicate them clearly and accurately, that the Gospels themselves weren't put into writing until sometime later, and that Paul's letters were circulated and used among the church earlier than that. So I say all that to say Paul was, he was one of the first Christians. And I go back to this over and over again, but he said, I only see through a glass darkly. I understand as a child, I don't have this fully figured out. When I read Paul, it feels like he's saying, we're not really going to get this until after we have passed on and become fully all in all with God, as long as we're here. And for Paul, I think it meant here locked in these bodies before our spirits were able to expand out of our bodies and join God. And I don't know if I'm fully on board with Paul's assessment of the body spirit problem. I think there's a lot of Greek philosophy mixed in there, which doesn't make it wrong. I don't think I believe it, because God chose to be in a body. And to me, that means that bodies are better than what Paul says they are. To bring this back to where I started, is there are lots of different understandings of Christianity, and it started early on. Paul's letters, if you read them, he was breaking up fights, arguments between different people in churches. And these were people who it was still close enough to the events of the Gospels that some of these people probably had known Jesus, been able to, heard him speak publicly in person, and still didn't know what to do exactly. They still didn't know exactly what rules to follow. They still didn't know what rituals to follow. They still didn't know what parts of their body to leave attached and not. And had big arguments about it that Paul had to try to break up. Before we get into the meat of right? These are the basic ideas of Christianity that we're going to start exploring. I want to share my story with you in order for you to get a sense of where I'm coming from. And if you're somebody who doesn't want to explore faith, shake it up and, get in there and get your hands dirty and think about it sometimes irreverently or, question or critique, then this may not be the show for, this is not a show where we're just kind of repeating orthodoxy. But I know for me, that's the only way I learn. I don't just take things at face value. I got to take them apart and put them back together, and maybe they don't still work anymore. So then I have to figure out how they work so I can put them back together again and get them working again the right way. And it's the long way around the barn. My life would be so much easier if people just told me stuff and I was like, yes, that sounds great. I'm just going to agree with that. But that's not how I work. And now I want to tell you a little bit about where I've been, because I think knowing where you've been is an important part of knowing where you're going, at the risk of sounding like some kind of mystical poet, which I am not. And so, to give you a little bit of my background, I come from a fundamentalist background, and we used that word. I didn't hear the word evangelical the way that it's used now in the news, mostly to brand a certain political party almost, rather than a religious group. I didn't hear that word used that way very often as a kid when I was growing up in the Midwest. But we were proudly fundamentalist, meaning we were really close to what I believe to be the fundamental ideas of Christianity, and that everybody else, for some reason, was really wrong. I come from a very religious family. My grandfather, my dad's dad, was a minister in a very conservative denomination. It was part of the holiness movement, which was kind of the early 20th century American purity culture type religion that arose from Methodism. We were talking like straight-laced, don't dance, don't play cards, don't smoke, don't have sex because it might lead to dancing kind of people. This is, sort of footloose folks. But religion is a really important part of our culture in our family. We have family reunions that they cover a couple days and they culminate in a religious service in a picnic pavilion in a public park on Sunday morning. It's a very important part of our culture and our understanding of our relationships to one another. It's the air that we breathe. For family events, it's not at all unusual for spontaneous prayer to break out and for us to have certain assumptions of other people's beliefs about Jesus, or at least certain assumptions about their patience with our beliefs about Jesus. And, I differ a little bit from, there's differences among us all. I don't want to mean to say that we're a homogenous, monolithic group, but I do definitely differ. I'm a little out there on some topics, and, and it can create a little bit of tension. Thankfully, we are also loyal as a family, and I think people give me kind of the benefit of the doubt. I tend to be sort of too Christian for non-Christian circles and not Christian enough for really Christian circles. So that's a place I think that a lot of listeners out there might be.
Feels like I'm still faking it. Maybe that's okay. Who the hell am I supposed to be? Oh.
When I was a teenager, by that point, I had already been saved and or born again and or asked Jesus into my heart and or been washed in the blood and or, I mean, you name the metaphor. There are a lot of different ways that we talk about salvation within that evangelical culture. I had been to the altar to have a moment of surrendering my life to Christ a few times. That as a child, summer camp, every day there was a tabernacle service that happened at the end of the day. And then at the end of camp, that Friday night when everybody's, we're all like now we're brothers and sisters in arms and crying because we're not going to see each other ever again. And then there's a lady playing on the old camp piano, Just As I Am, and crying, smelly preteens are coming up to the altar and giving their lives to Jesus. I've been part of that scene. And I don't say that to say that there isn't sincerity to it. I believed and wanted this lifestyle. Then I think later when I was 13, I started really my mind started growing and I started feeling a little bit more independent about my future, my agency in the world. I was listening to my dad and one of my uncles talk about just talking about the Bible one night, sitting at the kitchen table, as one does. And I started crying and I just said, I want to be part of what you are doing right now. So they both prayed with me and I went through, I guess what is known as the sinner's prayer. It's a specific prayer that's related to a certain belief about what it is that we're doing in that transaction with Jesus in order to be saved from the fate that we deserve as sinful people. And then I started studying the Bible in earnest and thinking of myself as a Christian, and not just a Christian as my family, but as a deliberate choice. It was later in my teens, a few years later, there's big differences that happen between 13 and say 16. And I ran into some questions, and I will gladly admit that these questions had a lot to do with the kind of lifestyle that I wanted to lead as a growing teenager. And it wasn't what you would consider to be the lifestyle that popular Christianity promotes. I wanted sex, drugs, rock and roll, and I was looking askance at salvation and going, this doesn't make as much sense to me anymore. And although my motives were pretty hedonistic, the questions still, a lot of these questions still stick with me, and they're going to be, at least as a launching point, the backbone of where we're going with this show. I had a bunch of questions, in this world where my baseline was, we're all sinners. There's something broken about us that causes us to desire to do things that are different than what God wants us to do. That God is this all-powerful, omniscient figure who wants us to live a certain way, created us. We, as a species or as a race, rebelled, and then we're constantly on the bad side of God. God that would tell humans to do things and we wouldn't do things, and occasionally you kill everybody or curse everybody, and they would be taken over by another country. They would have to be in exile. Their crops wouldn't grow. And if they did what they were supposed to, they would be rewarded. And we would have to burn things and sacrifice things. And eventually it got to Jesus, that God wanted to forgive us, but the only thing that would pay the price that we owed was a perfect sacrifice. And the only perfect sacrifice was God himself. So God embodied himself and then came and then was killed and rose again from the dead. But we have to believe, if we believe in some part of that, then we become recipients of the justice or justification or absolution that comes from that sacrifice, that like our debt is paid and it's a free gift, but we have to accept it. If we don't accept it, then we get punished because we were already headed for punishment, so on. I mean, this is the pop culture, the pop culture Christianity. When you see a cartoon, Tom and Jerry are running around and Tom gets hit really hard on the head with a skillet. He ends up getting punished for all the terrible things that he's done to Jerry and ends up on the down escalator instead of the up escalator. Or this is where you see the kind of cartoony, you have fire and devil with the horns and the pitchfork and all that. So here I am in the middle of all this, and I look at the whole system, and it just doesn't make any sense. I had friends that didn't believe, and I totally could see why. I could totally see why everything that they said about Christianity and this kind of giant cosmic Santa Claus business were why these things seemed ridiculous to them. Jump forward to college, where I now, as a burgeoning young intellectual, I had an axe to grind. I actually became convinced that Christianity was just one of many mythological systems that all seem to follow a very similar pattern, like the monomythic pattern that's laid out by Joseph Campbell in his book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces, and a lot of other interviews and articles. But the idea that within humanity, there's this kind of archetypical story, this legendary story of the hero, and the hero has to leave their home community and they go and they learn things from elsewhere through trial and tribulation. And then they come back and they bring their wisdom to the people. And there are other elements and pieces of different religious systems that all seem to be kind of borrowed. Even the idea of the God that we kill and devour and then take in his power, like the rituals around Dionysus. And I know that's not really how you say it in Greek, but I'm not really trained in ancient Greek. So I think it's Dionysus. Anyway, so I really, I went after ideas like hell when we read Dante and try to peel away how many of the ideas that we get about hell are from the accumulation of thousands of years of pop culture and not from the Bible itself, that there are many fewer mentions of hell in the Bible. And even when, Jesus talks the most about hell than anybody else, but the word that he uses is Gehenna, which is a valley, an actual valley that's outside of Jerusalem that, is kind of it had a sordid history of, people, human sacrifices there, and had become this horrible trash dump. Think about the worst town that you can think of nearby. And, Jesus saying, well, that's where you're going to go. If you continue in your sin, you're going to end up in whatever that bad part of town is. Obviously, it's a metaphor. The idea of conflating it with ideas of Hades and other mythologies of the hellish underworld, and also tying it in with the lake of fire, which is talked about in Revelation, but not elsewhere. And kind of skipping the fact that Paul doesn't talk about hell at all. He actually talks about death, but then saying, well, what he means is, he's talking about the eternal death, which is going to hell, is adding another level of symbolism to the whole thing. And even the story of Satan, of the fallen angel, and everything that John Milton wrote about that, yes, there is a Satan character in the Hebrew Bible, and there is a character of Lucifer, and there is another story that talks about a falling star, and there's a beast, but they're disjointed because they're in different books written by different people at different times to accomplish different things. And some very clever poets wove all these things together. And then suddenly we could have the devil show up on Bugs Bunny. But as I'm peeling all this back, I'm going like, oh, this is just nonsense. This is all made up. It's all invented. None of this is real. I've been lied to my whole life. I can now be free to do whatever I want and be whoever I want, because this horrible religion that's held me down my whole life the book has fallen apart in my hands. And then I'm taking this class about first century Christianity that really talks about the Gospels and talks about the origins of the Gospels and how they were written and the overlaps between the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the other source material that they probably pulled from the shared source of the Q Gospel, and then John's Gospel, how it was written later and what it was trying to accomplish that was different than the synoptic Gospels. But out of all of this, I had the opportunity to read what was really on the page of the Gospels. And I realized that this whole salvation scenario, which looms a little bit larger in, like in Paul's letter to the Romans, isn't really something that Jesus talks about. I mean, Jesus forgives sin. He forgives sin on the spot, and without asking a price necessarily for it. He just says you're forgiven. And he gives his apostles the license to go and forgive as well. He does a lot of healing. He does a lot of exorcisms, which is, we could do a whole episode just on that. And he does other nature miracles. He turns water into wine. He walks on water. He calms storms. But he also does a lot of teaching. And that teaching isn't necessarily about salvation. There's a lot of teaching that would be considered, dare I say it, social justice, about the poor and the widows and the prisoners and the orphans, and how we treat the outcasts, and how we, by his example, how we treat women, how we think about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Are we letting legalism get in the way of actually feeding people and actually healing people? He talks about things like heaven and hell, but he also talks about things like the nations being judged based on their treatment of the poor, of the foreigner. And he talks all about the kingdom. And I always thought the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God was heaven, like far away heaven on a cloud with harps, praising God all day. That was like going to church forever, which at the time didn't sound very exciting, but it was a lot better than the alternative. But it sounded like the kingdom of heaven was really a value system. There was like the reign of heaven that started now.
Don't know what I'm looking for, but I'm feeling better now. Got something to avow. I'm sick of the same shit. I'm moving on now.
felt like I had gotten down to the bedrock of what the gospel was about. I still held off because I wanted to be a rational, modern, scientific thinker about it, and see, is there evidence that this is true? And I kind of zeroed down to, there's a lot of things, I could prove, or I could be relatively confident, at least in the historical existence of Jesus and his impact, and the fact that there were people around that talked about him and the people that he had influenced. I couldn't prove the resurrection. And going all the way back through time, I really couldn't even prove the existence of God. And of all the things in the Bible, I felt like those were the kind of the two most important. That, if there's a God, particularly if that God expects something of me, I want to know that. And I want to know how to stay on that God's good side. And the cue about the resurrection I took from Paul, because Paul's the one who said, if Christ is not risen from the dead, then all of this is vanity. None of this is, this is all futile. None of it's worth it. And I'm with him on that. That's the one miracle, aside from some miracles that I've been a part of in my life. The resurrection is a miracle that I at least hope for. I know it's weird, it's unscientific, but maybe it's symbolic. Maybe Christ resurrected in everybody's hearts, or maybe the resurrection was the appearance of the Holy Spirit, or I don't know. Maybe it's a way of us resurrecting from our dark, sinful selves. But I still have hope for that one. But I also have a lot of comfort with not knowing exactly what's going on and not being certain. And certainty in other people kind of bugs me, because I don't believe that they've got it figured out either. But I have to be patient with the fact that other people aren't as comfortable with ambiguity as I am. But I did finally, after a while of trying to hold my beliefs off, and when I prayed in a way that was very modified. It was kind of like, God, that is God, if you're there, and you're the kind of God that cares about people, and that you listen to our supplications, and you care about us. And this after an entire lifetime of being able to just call God on the bat phone, or even just crawl up into his lap and be like, Dad, I'm having a hard day. To have this distance from the divine, even though it was all, perfectly intellectually supported, was driving me crazy. There was so much data, I wasn't going to figure it out for sure in my lifetime. For me just to go, okay, I'm going to start all over again from the existence of the world. I'm going to walk outside and go, oh, it's sunny outside. There's a sun in the sky. Maybe the sun is a god. I wonder where that energy comes from. I wonder what the sky is made of. Going through the entire history of humanity on my own to go back to what is the force that brings these blades of grass out of the ground? That if I kind of threw everything out and said, I'm just going to start completely new scientific inquiry, that unless I had some kind of big revelation along the way where I got kind of like a magical data dump, I wasn't going to figure it out necessarily. It could take lifetimes. And in the meantime, I was not going to be a blank slate. As much as I had tried to hold off these beliefs, there were certain fears and hopes and assumptions that I had that were shaped by everything I'd ever learned. And, when somebody talks about the beginning of the universe, somebody who says that the universe has to have been created by a God has certain assumptions about how things work and cause and effect, and maybe not the clearest understanding of, if nothing existed before the universe, then where did God exist, and how did God exist for time infinitely backwards, etc. But for somebody who believes that the universe came into being without God, there are also assumptions built in with that. One, that this is even possible, and that the universe could come from nothing spontaneously, or that the universe could itself have existed infinitely backwards through time. However far back you go, it gets weird. But I feel like we all have to, at some point, there's some stuff that we just don't know, that we've got to fill in the gaps with assumptions or guesses about how things came to be. And I knew that my whole life was shaped around Christianity. Not only was I in this Christian Western culture, but, it was my tradition, my family roots, that shaped my philosophy, my view of human nature, everything. And so I think the best I figured out I could come up with was, one, I had to admit, I had to sort of come out as a Christian. Like, I'm a Christian. I admitted it. And it was huge relief for me to be like, no matter what my intellect says, or, all my learning, my desire to be scientific, like, this is just the truth. And, and I'm going to roll with it. But I also, I came up with this kind of 2-part system, which it's probably not unique, but it was, but it felt like I came up with it on my own, and it's worked so far. And that's that I would do the best that I knew to do with what I understood at the time. So to keep myself ahead of any kind of like galactic morality police, that I would hope that God would expect me, if God's there and God expects morality, that God wouldn't expect me to do any more than I know how to do. So at any given time, to be honest and true and good within the rules as I understand them. This within the love your neighbor as yourself, and love God and obey God's commandments as a way of showing God love. So that's part 1. Do the best you can with what you know. But 2, always keep an open mind to the next thing to come along. The apostles, to my knowledge, had no reason to expect that once their hero teacher died, that he would come back from the dead. This was not part of their understanding of this prophecy, of this process. And if somehow, when Mary Magdalene came back from the tomb and said, he's gone out of the tomb is empty, and I saw him. If those guys hadn't then been open enough to the idea, because that's a ridiculous idea. Like, we kind of take that for granted. Like, the first person whoever convinced somebody else who hadn't been brought up in Christianity, who was just like, and then he came back from the dead. We tend to think pre-scientific people were dumb, but I had to believe that people in the first century were not so dumb that they didn't know that dead people stayed dead. Like it's still that's a hard sell. If something spectacular didn't happen around that time, then I'm not gonna go all evangelist here on you, but like, that's a hard sell. Even for pre-scientific people to be like, oh yeah, and then he got up and, danced around, flew up to heaven. So if they hadn't somehow opened their eyes to the idea that somehow Jesus had been resurrected, then we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Same, with Paul. Paul had some kind of revelation that changed his entire view of the universe from beginning to end. And that just sticking with the ideas that we already know isn't the way to revelation. Being afraid of learning new things is not the way of revelation. And all the early heroes of Christianity would not have been that if they had not been open to some really radical new ways of thinking about things. So that's where I ended up. And, that was more than 20 years ago, as I said, but I've been sort of on that path this whole time. I'm a Christian. I'm a questioning Christian. I'm sometimes an angry Christian. I'm a frustrated Christian. Sometimes I'm a joyful Christian, committed Christian. I believe in miracles in certain circumstances. I believe in prayer, although I got some conflicting ideas about it. I believe that being oriented toward God and love and the love of one another is a better path than being oriented toward the self. Now, whether that plays itself out literally in you're either going to be playing harps on a cloud or shoveling coal, while the devil's poking you in the butt with a pitchfork, we'll get to that. But that's the overall shape of my journey. And, I tell you, the reason I'm doing this now is that I want, as comfortable as I am with the ambiguity, I want to figure things out and I want to explore them. And I want to make sure that I don't just rest in the mystery to the point where I'm not continually trying to know things if they can be known. I want to know what my creed is and to be able to communicate it to other people. And if you've listened to this podcast so far, you know that I'm not a man who says things in a really short and concise way. So I would like to tighten up my elevator speech a little bit on this is what I think Christianity is about. I got more that I could talk about this week, but I think I'm going to save it for the next episode. But thank you for listening to the story and for embarking on this journey with me to continue to seek the specifics of what it means to be a Christian and to explore the history of some of these ideas that are the ideas that keep me up at night and probably kept theologians up at night 500, 700, 1200, 3500 years ago. And I'm excited to go on this journey with you. And I appreciate you coming along with me. So anyway, God bless. And we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of Faith Still Seeking. To find out more about this program, go to faithstillseeking.com. To find out more about my work, you can find me at kellywilson.com. Our theme song, Purpose, is written and performed by musician Steve RX. You can find more of his music on Spotify, Apple Music, and other streaming platforms. Thank you for listening, and God bless.
I guess I found some kind of purpose.